Hello and welcome to History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I am thrilled to be joined by Laura C. Rader, author of the novel Hatfield, 1677. Laura, welcome.
Hi, thank you, Colin, for having me on your podcast.
Of course. Well, I always like to start with the history behind a novel. In your case, you write about the King Philip's War. Can you tell us what that was and kind of the circumstances of the novel?
Sure, yeah. King Philip's War was apparently one of the bloodiest wars in American history. So if you go back before our country was a country, because the Civil War usually gets the distinction as being the most brutal, but if you go back, um, in terms of colonists and Native Americans killed in King Philip's War, it per capita was horrendous. King Philip was actually the son of the Native American who welcomed the Pilgrims to Plymouth. But over the course of time, of course, he realized that maybe that welcome was ill-advised, and so he gathered together the various Algonquian tribes in the Northeast and waged war on the colonists. And it went on for about 4 or 5 years, and it started in about 1675.
So is King Philip then a name given to a Native American?
Yes, his real name was Metacomet, but the colonists decided to call him King Philip. I mean, he was a sachem, he was a chief, and apparently he didn't mind that name. He knew that king was a worthy title, and so he he uh, he didn't mind being known by that moniker.
And where does Hatfield in 1677 fit into all of that?
There were multiple little settlements along the Connecticut River north of Springfield, Massachusetts at that time. They were pretty much the most remote, and in terms of being remote from Boston, which was the main center in Massachusetts. So they were the furthest west, the furthest north, and most of the Native Americans involved in King Philip's War were in New England, and they were also joined by Native American tribes from Canada. And a lot of the tribes were nomadic, so they would be in Canada during the wintertime and they would come south in the summer. And for a long time, the people in Hatfield and Deerfield and the surrounding villages had worked side by side with those tribes. They worked together to burn the forests off in the fall so they could plant corn. They shared their pasture land, but it didn't last very long. It was an uneasy truce, I guess. Um, and and so when King Philip decided, that enough is enough, there's too many people coming, then little skirmishes broke out that turned into battles, that turned into full-out war.
And who are the characters that you rely upon in order to get into this history and share it with readers?
Um, Actually, my ninth great grandparents lived in Hatfield, Massachusetts, and I found that fact out about 30 years ago when I was researching my genealogy. So Benjamin Waite and his wife Martha Waite were colonists in Hatfield. He was also a scout, a volunteer military scout, so that put him in a position of having to be involved in any battles. And she was his wife. They had three little girls, eventually had 8 children, but at the time of the novel, they had three little girls, and she was pregnant at the time of the novel, too. And then the other character I feature is Ashpelon, and he was the sachem of the tribe that attacked Hatfield in 1677.
And so you used the actual names of the your ancestors?
I did. I used the actual names of my ancestors. Ashpelon was referred to, one of the captives kept a journal and referred to Ashpelon by name. So I assumed that was his name. Very little, of course, records about him. Yes, I tried to keep all the names the same. I looked into the legalities, and unless a ninth great grandchild wants to complain, Apparently, that's fine. I did have to change several names just because the Puritans weren't very imaginative in their naming. And so there was a preponderance of Johns and Sarahs and Marys. So I did change a few first names, but I tried to keep the rest pretty authentic.
And you tell the story from each of those three main characters' points of view, kind of shifting between chapters. Tell me about that kind of decision to tell the story that way and how you were able to share more of the story by having each of those perspectives included.
Yeah, thank you. Um, well, for some reason, I started off first person point of view, and that's limiting in terms of more than one character. So then I realized that basically I realized that once Martha Waite was captured and Benjamin Waite was not, that their stories would diverge, and therefore I needed two points of view so that I could tell both stories. And then, probably halfway through the first draft, I realized that Ashpelon needed a point of view. I mean, more than just reflected through the eyes of the colonists. He needed his own point of view. I wanted to bring him out as uh, on equal footing, at least in the book, if not in reality. So that's how that came about for the three points of view, and it was pretty challenging for my first novel, but I enjoyed doing that. It did help the immediacy of the story, I think.
And you mentioned that you're directly related to these people, but I'm curious how you kind of discovered your interest in this history to the point that you wanted to tell the story.
Yeah. Well, I've always liked history. My father was a history professor, college history professor. I practically minored in history in college. And then I taught school for 30 years, and I taught English and I taught history when I taught in the upper grades. In the lower grades, I taught everything. Um, so I think because of that, I got interested in my genealogy and discovered a lot of interesting stories there. And I had always enjoyed writing. So when I found this story, it just sounded like a very good love story, and also a very good story about how they say everyone's the hero of their own story. How it was, the many of the accounts of the attack were written in the, as you said, 19th century, and the 19th century tend to romanticize that whole that whole conflict, as the avenging white hero versus everybody else. Um, so I thought that would be a good way to delve into that in a little more, little broader perspective. So that's kind of what brought me to the story. And I basically did sit on the idea for a long time until I retired, basically. So,
And you talked about doing genealogical research, but I'm assuming then you moved beyond that research.
oh,
Can you
yeah.
talk about some of the research you did? I'm curious to know, like, what kind of research did you do that was documented, and also did you go and talk to experts? Were you able to visit museums and get some help that way? What kind of research did you do?
I At the time that I wrote most of the story, I lived in California. So unfortunately, it was a little. I wanted to, but it was a little cost prohibitive to fly out to the Northeast. Um, so almost all of my research was online. I did reach out to the Hatfield Historical Museum in Hatfield, and found, but again, online, I found a lot of information there. And there, I tried to cast a really broad net for my research. So, and I also wanted to find primary documents instead of secondary sources. So I wanted to find the original letters, and I did. There's basically a book called Papers Concerning the Attack on Hatfield and Deerfield in 1677, and it's the correspondence from that time. So Major Pynchon was basically the mayor of Springfield and the leader of the Connecticut Army. And so Benjamin Waite had to correspond with him. He had to correspond with the governor of Albany, New York. He had to correspond with the governor of Boston, and even Lord Frontenac, the Count of Quebec. in Canada. So all those people got involved. So because of that, there was a lot of letters. So that was wonderful. And then, as I said, Quentin Stockwell and one of the captives kept a diary, and that's available in the public domain too. And so I read that through, and it was only like maybe 20 pages, but it was day by day about his captivity, and that was the same. It was the same capture that Martha Waite was taken into, and so he's a character in the story, but he was also a real person. Um, let's see what else. The National Park Service recently opened up what they used to call Turner's Falls, and now they call it the Great Falls. And that is actually where my story starts, was with a massacre of unarmed Native Americans at that waterfall fishing grounds that they had. The colonists in Hatfield and Hadley and belonged to the United New England, kind of federation. And because of King Philip's War and all the casualties of the colonists, I think they had kind of reached their breaking point. And so the colonists just basically lost it. And they went, we don't care if this, we don't care if it's a camp of women and children. We don't care. We're done. And so I make that a pretty bad decision on Ben's part. I don't know how much choice in reality he had. I don't really know what his feelings were in reality, but in the story, he's reluctant, he's remorseful, and he comes back from that just not wanting to fight anymore, basically. So I used that research too, the archaeological research of the place.
You talked about reading correspondence and a diary. I'm curious how challenging it was to read the language of the time.
It it was surprisingly not too hard. Most of what I read, for starters, was digitized and typed, so I didn't have to deal with the script with the S that looks like an F. So that helped. So it wasn't, it was a source document that had at least been transcribed. Their language was interesting. It was kind of like right in the shift between modern English and Shakespearean English. So it takes a little getting used to it. It was very formal, of course, because it was written. So I had to remind myself of that when I was doing dialogue, that they probably wouldn't have been as formal in their dialogue, in their conversations, as they were in their letters.
Now, this is a debut for you. Can you, and you talk also, you mentioned also that you didn't write it until into retirement. What were some of the challenges for you of getting the story down on paper and then going through it and editing it and revising it and making it work as a narrative?
Oh, so many, as you know, as a fellow author. Well, ironically, I did start the story way back in, I'm going to date myself here, way back in 1995. And then I set it aside. And so then when I retired in 2020, and also COVID conveniently conspired at the same time, I thought, I'll write a novel like everybody else during COVID. And what I found was this like minuscule little floppy disk. And I went, oh, no, that's not going to happen. But I did find my notes. So I started over again. And I realized that it had been a long time since I had written anything of substance, basically college with my creative writing classes. So I started joining a lot of writers groups and groups on craft online, and the Southern California Writers Conference. I went to several of their conferences and tried to, kind of relearn everything that I knew about writing and plotting and that sort of thing. But I think the best advice I got was that your first draft just has to be ugly, and you just have to get the words out and you have to get it down, and then you can go back and tinker with it. So I spent like a summer doing some research that I felt I needed to do before I started writing. And then I just kind of jumped in, and I was pretty diligent about not letting things go. I'd be typing along and I'd come to a word or a situation and I'd go, oh, I have to research that. I have no idea. So I did stop frequently, but I finally finished the draft. I think it took me about, I think I started in August and I finished it in December, the first draft. Um, and then I sent it out to beta readers and editors, and I probably revised it a dozen times. Um, and then once I started approaching small presses or publishers or agents, I got quite a bit of concern over the subject matter. And so they suggested that I hire a sensitivity reader. And I was disappointed because it felt like starting over. But I took a class from Sarah Elizabeth Sawyer in American fiction, American writing about Indians for fiction writers. I forget the name exactly. Fiction writing for American Indians. And she is a Choctaw Native American, and she's also an author. So it was a like 40-hour course in just biases and things to watch out for when you're writing about Native Americans. And then I also did have an editor who was a sensitivity reader go through one of the final drafts to alert me to anything that seemed that glaring to her. Um, so yeah, a lot of revision.
Well, I know that was a daunting process for you, but it is really nice to hear you articulate, the steps in that process, because I think people are can be very disillusioned by what it takes to actually start a novel and then publish a novel. Um, but good for you for sticking through it and going step by step. And now your novel's out there and it's being well received. How does that feel?
I'm thrilled. It's doing better than I expected it would actually. It's still hanging in there on Amazon. So any of us can help. Um, I was fortunate to find a hybrid publisher. That's kind of a new way of publishing. Um, and her name is Holly, and her company is Acorn Publishing. And she really believed in the story. She wanted to work with me. She believed in the story. And they are fairly selective. It's not as difficult as traditional publishing, obviously. Uh, but they probably take about 50% of the authors who want to work with them, and the rest, they're like revise and resubmit type thing. Um, but I had it professionally edited uh, before they would take it, and she also read it through herself. She did a read through, and then they have all the other people involved in the production process, which the reason I went with a hybrid publisher is I knew self-publishing was an option, but that seemed more daunting, honestly, than writing the book. So they took care of the cover and the formatting and the distribution and all of that.
I think that's great. And again, it just exemplifies that you got it so far and you went to that class and you got it edited. And then even after that, then once the publisher gets it, well, there's another year of going through it and making it into just a high quality, readable product that people are going to enjoy.
Yes, yes, and I wanted to do it right. I there's everybody has different reasons for publishing books or doing them, in whatever way they choose. But for me, I knew that even though I had a good amount of confidence in my writing, I knew that it was going to take a village. So I wanted to reach out to people, which wasn't always easy. It's you get some negative comments along the way and some suggestions for cut this whole chapter and things like that. And it was a learning process for me to be able to finally accept that as help instead of criticism.
Yeah, every author goes through that, and I thinking of my own novel, there are two chapters that I had to cut because I kept getting feedback saying, "Oh, this doesn't fit here," and I liked those chapters.
Right? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, well, after you had this, you had the connection of your ancestors being from this, going through this, and then you obviously had some interest in history as you talked about growing up. But what, after delving deep into it and writing a whole story about this history, I'm curious to know kind of what you learned, what surprised you, and you also talked about earlier generations of historians romanticizing the past. what do you want readers to take away from it now, as you're able to look at everything through a contemporary view?
Oh, let's see. Well, okay. So first of all, my kind of it changed over time as I wrote the story. I think my goals and my insights. Initially, I pretty much had it pegged as what a great love story. You know, how many men, present company excluded, I'm sure, how many men would travel on foot 400 miles in the wilderness in the winter to rescue their wife and kids? You know, and we might say we would do it, but we're talking no cars, no trails, no roads, no, and even horses were not a very viable means of transportation in the winter because you had to cross icy rivers and all of that. Um, so initially, I really just thought it was kind of the hero rescuing the damsel in distress. But then as I got deeper into it, I realized it was more complex than that, and it was there was a broader issues involved, obviously. Of um, I realized how that I hadn't realized before how disunited the colonies were at that time in the late 1600s, where you had to, as Benjamin Waite had to get permission to go after his wife and children. He had to seek funding from the governments. He had to reach out to the governor of New York and the governor of um, Quebec and seek their support, and you know, get a letter of credit that he could give to the Native Americans as a ransom that they could convert into French francs, or they could convert into whatever coinage, you know, of the time. So it was beyond the, you know, trading wampum type situation. It was very political. And that surprised me. And then the other part that I delved into more when I was writing was the simple survival of the captives. Um, so even though, you know, Benjamin and his wife were farmers and he was a military scout, and she was, you know, obviously a pioneer woman, the conditions that the captives were in and the Native Americans were in as they made their way to Canada were very brutal. You know, their protection from the elements was nothing like what we have nowadays, obviously, and um, the game was not as abundant. I thought, you know, it would be pretty easy hunting back then because there would be more game, but apparently not. They had a lot of trouble finding food. So that was another element that I hadn't counted on, that I brought into it. And then finally, I think the Native American perspective, even since 1995, has changed. Our perspective as a nation on the fate of Native Americans from the time that the first colonists arrived here. I think we've learned a lot as a country, as you know, that that we just came and we took, and we didn't, you know, we didn't consider we didn't consider what we were doing. I was also surprised though that there were quite a lot of fairly, I want to say, up and up peaceful negotiations with the Native Americans around this time, um, like before and after and during King Philip's War. But I think, at least in my novel and from what I learned, it wasn't feasible at that time because the European colonists so outnumbered the Native Americans. Um, Partly because smallpox came over early with the first colonists, with the Spanish colonists in the 1500s, and then with Jamestown in the early 1600s. So that by 1677, apparently there was, you know, a third to a half of the original Native American population had already been decimated by smallpox. So, you know, the colonists, even when some of them were trying to be fair and just, they just so outnumbered the Native Americans that it was almost too easy to take their land away from them.
So at this point, are you kind of exhausted by the process and ready to relax in your retirement, or are you diving into another project?
No, I no, it's now that I've gotten into writing, it does feel like a full-time passion. Um, and it also keeps me from checking my, Amazon stats every day. So I've already written a second novel, um, which surprisingly doesn't have anything to do with Hatfield 1677. It is historical, but it's based on again, it started off being based on genealogy because I have a great grandmother whose last name is Teachins, or was. So when I was studying the Teachins surname, I came across a man named Paul Teachins, who was the composer for the score for the Broadway musical of The Wizard of Oz in 1902. And he worked with L. Frank Baum and Denslow and everybody that was involved in the original book of The Wizard of Oz. And I was really hoping he was a relative, but he wasn't. But then I decided it didn't matter. I don't have to only write about relatives. So went off on a whole different tangent of, the Gilded Age and turn of the century, um, which was a lot easier in many ways because, at least that's something within our frame of reference where people live in cities and have carriages and that sort of thing. But so that's out there. I'm querying that one. And I just got another full request today, actually. So happy about that. And then several of my friends have told me I should write a sequel to Hatfield. So that's percolating here.
Well, congratulations, Laura. It sounds like
Thank you.
your new career is going really well, and
Thank you.
I can hear all the hard work that you go through, and it's definitely worth it, and you've given readers a great story.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm very happy about it. And I hope everybody enjoys it as much as I did writing it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining me on the podcast. Congratulations on Hatfield 1677, and I look forward to what you come out with next.
Thank you, Colin. Appreciate it.